And we have people coming in.
How can you tell that people are there?
Very top right, I see panelists on one side and I see attendees on the other.
Ah.
So hello, attendees. Oops, see, I just did what I wasn't supposed to do. There we go. So everyone is arriving for the panel where we're going to talk about, I'm trying to look for the actual name of it. I don't even remember anymore. We're going to be talking about taking real. So I'm going to give it about another minute for people to show up.
It's called From the Spellbook to the Novel, Using Real Magic and Fiction.
That's what you're in.
Yeah.
Yay. All right.
I had to check the email.
Right. Who are we? All righty. So I'm Crystal Sarakas. I help organize RoberCon. I'm a writer. And of last year, I'm also an editor. I also have a little side business where I help authors navigate the fun world of marketing and book formatting and editing and Amazon and all of those fun things. I've been writing for a few years. I have an almost novel, almost finished, that I'm hoping to have out in the spring of next year. Except I got an idea in the last panel that I might have to change the whole thing. So, you know, we'll see. I'm going to let the other panelists introduce ourselves, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what we're talking about. Everybody stop being so polite.
Yeah, all right. I am Deborah Blake. I am the author of 13 nonfiction books on magic and modern witchcraft, most of them from Llewellyn, and also a tarot deck and an oracle deck. And I'm also the author of 13 novels, many of them from Berkeley, some of them self-published, specifically my Baba Yaga series, some people might be familiar with. So yeah, I write magic with nonfiction and fiction.
And I am April Steenburgh. I am a short story author primarily and a librarian. I also am co-founder of Fairy Cat Press, a small indie press, and I work as a VPA, a personal assistant for a good handful of authors.
So the idea behind this came to me a little while ago when there was an article I found on the internet, and I believe it's generally true, that Wicca is now the third largest religious belief structure in the United States after Christianity, and I want to say Islam was the second. And it started me kind of thinking about how if you were growing up and reading fiction, fantasy fiction, especially 15, 20, 25 years ago, if you saw a mention of Wicca, it was just kind of generally considered kooky. It was generally considered just to be completely part of the fantasy world, and nobody took it very seriously. And I think that has changed, and I'm not just speaking about Wicca. We've seen a resurgence in old religions across the globe. And so what I wanted to just talk about, and I want our audience to submit questions for, is just this idea of taking real religions and how we treat those when we put them into our made-up stories. So just to start out, I mean, to both of my fellow panelists, have you seen this shift too, or am I just making this all up, when I have conversations with myself at night?
One of the things that I found happen is that when I go to conventions, and not just pagan conventions, but writing conventions, I run into a whole lot more people that say, oh, I practice some variation of this. I practice Wicca or witchcraft or paganism or something. And I do think that those people are much more visible and much more vocal than they used to be.
It's interesting too, I used to manage bookstores, so I have the weird publishing end on that. And over about a decade, as you saw a rise in urban fantasy and contemporary fantasy genres, you saw a lot more of the pulling from existent religions, regardless of how mainstream they were, as opposed to the more epic fantasy, Tolkien-esque. We had some dwarves, we had some elves, adventure fiction. So I think we have kind of a give and take where you have that genre just explode, and they needed to pull from something.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, I think if I have to look about this, and I want to put it in the framework first of contemporary fantasy, Mercedes Lackey's Diane Tregarde series.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, it's wonderful.
You know, I kind of giggle at it today, I'll be honest. But for me, as a little baby pagan back in the, you know, late 80s, early 90s, that was the first time I encountered a witch in the modern world just doing her thing. You know, and that it was just literally as much a part of her life as, you know, reading a book where somebody has a, you know, one of the more mainstream religions that we're aware of. What books have you read, or authors do you remember reading that kind of made it feel right for you?
I love Kim Harrison's series. I mean, obviously it was set in a world that's not quite our world. It was after a plague or something. But despite the fact that she also had vampires and other supernatural creatures, her witch came across as very realistic to me, you know, acknowledging the fact that it was urban fantasy and therefore she could do some magical stuff that, for instance, I couldn't necessarily do, that you know of. Just saying. But I loved the way she presented witches in that series, because there was a limit to the witch's power. And there was a price when she used her power. It wasn't like she could just snap her fingers and say, bibbity bobbity boo or whatever, and accomplish whatever. She would take out her tools in her kitchen and she would take the ingredients for the spells. And if she didn't have the right ingredients, she had to figure something out. And it took her energy, and there was always a price. So for me, that was a really great example.
Mm.
Doing the thing I usually do, where yes, I have a million examples, but none of them will immediately come to mind. But the normalizing, this is just a part of life. This is what they do. Any book that went out of their way to draw attention to how cool or shiny it was, turned me off. It didn't do it for me. It hit the this isn't integrated. This isn't a part of the story. This is just something you're trying to fit, whether or not it actually does.
Right. That organic feeling.
Not Wicca, but that's why the Rebecca Roanhorse books work so well for me, with the Dine mythology, mythos, world build, everything, because it's integrated fully. I mean, when I was a baby heathen, there was nothing except for, say, Marvel that really, and that's a stretch. I was happy to find stuff in manga, Japanese writing, that would just have something for me to grab onto.
Right. So, because this is a panel geared more for the writers, we talk about the importance of that integration as something that makes it feel very relevant to us. So how, when you're writing a story where you're featuring, you know, whether it's a heathen, whether it's a Wiccan, you know, different things, what are you doing to make that feel organic and integrated in your stories?
Part of what I do is I figure out in the beginning how realistic the world is going to be. I've written, paranormal romance that's set in the modern world and just has some elements. My Baba Yaga is a magical witch, not a Wicca witch. She can snap her fingers and have things happen, although she has limitations as well. So I decide what the rules for magic are going to be and how realistic I want those to be. And that has to stay consistent throughout the story, throughout the world that you've built. Because if you start out in the first chapter and say, okay, this character is a Wiccan and she's just like me, and then in chapter 4, you have her pull lightning down from the sky to strike her enemies, people are going to start throwing the book across the room. and rightfully so.
I hit it a bit from the research librarian end, where I need to know, and not just the ins and outs of a particular path, but be aware of the maybe tropes or stereotypes and try to backpedal from those as much as humanly possible.
Mm-hmm.
One of my students for an English class actually wrote a paper on how voodoo was presented in American media as comparing it to actual practice,
Mm-hmm.
and noticing a gap they had never realized existed. So being aware of presentation, stereotypes, things that we might assume or are used to seeing that aren't actually the thing.
Right, right.
It's a respect issue.
Right. Well, and I think that brings up the conversation around, if you're going to write about a different religion, especially a different religion that is so tied into a different culture. We referred to, the Dine with Rebecca Roanhorse. We talk about, voodoo and other, kind of African-based religious traditions. Do you feel comfortable writing that? Do you feel like, where's the line for research for you, and also just being able to embrace that in a storytelling place?
I would say not just book research, have human research, have people check what you're doing from the place where you're writing to, basically.
Yeah, I
agree. Like a main.
If you're writing something that isn't your culture or your background, even if it's a relatively small character, you may want to get some beta readers who come from that background, if you can find them. You can't always, but it is really well, for one thing, you're much less likely to get those letters, but also it is a matter of respect. Especially in this day and age, we are much more conscious of the fact that a lot of what has been presented to us has been stereotypes, has been assumptions that we made about other cultures, not from any maliciousness, but from ignorance. And we no longer have the excuse of ignorance. So if you don't happen to have a research librarian handy, you can do research yourself, but don't just rely on the internet. For the love of God or goddess, don't just rely on the internet. And if you can, yes, find some people who know something about whatever it is you're writing about if you don't know.
And I think I'll add on to that, if you're, we call them sensitivity readers in different, aspects. And for writers out there who might be, pursuing this, I will say, don't ask them to do this for free unless that's their choice. Because this is an exchange of talent and skill and, expertise. And so it's not just, hey, can you read this for me and tell me everything that I've gotten right and everything that I've gotten wrong, and just walk away from that.
Yeah, especially because it is extremely time consuming to read manuscripts.
Yeah.
Short stories a little bit less, but even so, if you're asking for somebody's time and their energy, and you're asking them to keep you out of trouble, essentially, they're doing a job for you and you need to behave accordingly. I mean, they're your best friend and you're really lucky.
At the very base, you're literally looking at hiring someone like you would as a content editor. You're looking at feedback, input, not just a quick read of, hey, this worked or not. So
just a reminder, if you have questions, use that little Q&A thing. We would love to have questions from our audience. Where, and I may answer this question first to just start out, where are you not seeing real magic, real, religious things that may not just be Christianity? Where are you not seeing them show up in stories? And I think the answer for me is, I want to see this in space opera. I want to see some sort of exploration of an Earth-based religion in a far sci-fi future.
I'd read. I'm not seeing it in romance. I read a fair amount of romance, especially since the pandemic hit and my brain is not so good with urban fantasy and deep books and nitty gritty things. And in romance, I'm not seeing, I mean, they used to have, more paranormal romance, or like the cozy paranormals where there'd be a witch as the main character. But in standard romances that portray people's real lives, I haven't really seen anything that looks to me like a integration of different religions. And I don't know if that's because they're afraid of turning off people who don't follow those religions, or if there's just not room with all the sex. I don't know.
I don't know,
But
there's some pretty specific sex-based magic that they could be working into that. So just saying. April?
I read and write a lot of the kind of creeping horror sort of stories, and a lot of those, and I think it's a function of the genre. You get a lot of the tropes and stereotypes because they're trying to grab a visceral response. It'd be neat to see if you could get that sort of horror reaction with actually working through, say, a witch or something, as opposed to just, oh God, it's a witch, just instead of focusing on just that horror hit. I like the kind of creeping up on you horror. If we could look at, different aspects of any of these systems, you could probably build that same sort of dread without relying on a hard hit impact stereotype.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I'd love to read that. So
no, that actually sounds really cool. Are there other tropes out there that you think that, I never want to say a trope is bad, okay? A trope just exists because a lot of people have done it. But I do think it's a really interesting writing exercise to look at what tropes exist and be like, okay, now how can I poke holes in this? How can I twist this inside out? So are there certain tropes that you see in this particular area that you would like to, play with maybe at some point?
I don't know if I have ones I particularly want to play with. I'd have to give that more thought. That I'm a little bit tired of having a witch be either very, very sexy or an old crone. And there doesn't seem to be anything in between. How about an old sexy crone? I don't know. But where are the regular people, which most of us are, where are the women with the green hair, and so that for me is one of the tropes I'm a little tired of, is that there only seem to be, one end of the spectrum or the other, and they forget the middle.
Whereas I tend to like to play with the gender expectations of witch isn't just a woman.
Yeah.
So I like to play with that myself, because you don't see much of that.
Yeah, and I think that that's reflected in kind of the internal conversations you see within the pagan community. And I use that as an incredibly huge umbrella where nobody agrees with anybody. But I do think that idea of gender, that we only see witches as, and not just women, but a very particular kind of woman. Show me the executive pagans that have, high-end lawyer jobs and are doing that instead of just, I think the trope that drives me nuts is the witch woman who has to have her own like apothecary shop.
Yeah, or a new age shop, or a pagan bookshop or something. I mean, I have a shop, it's full of artists. There are some, we actually have a surprising number of pagans in there, but it has nothing to do with pagans. It just is a artist cooperative shop, and that happens to be my day job.
So how would you play with gender?
I would love to see, and I don't feel qualified to write it myself. Let me start out by saying that. I would love to see a transgender witch character as a protagonist. I think that would be a really interesting way to integrate, the fact that we worship God and goddess. Well, what if those are combined in one person? I think that would be really neat. I'm not going to write it, but
as a non-binary, I would love to see that. Like,
well, maybe you should.
the weird, not weird, wow, just the having those gendered lines, I tend to flip it. I'll have male witches, because again, they exist, you just don't see them as much, because I guess they're not as sexy in novels, I don't know. And I don't think I've seen an NB. If someone in this panel has found an NB witch, please throw me a recommendation, like now.
Yeah, throw all your recommendations out in the chat.
That sort of, not even representation, but that sort of writing, that skill, that sort of playing and exploration would be phenomenal.
This was always my pet peeve with Dresden, is that everything he did, he had to be a wizard. And I'm looking at all of this and I'm like, dude, you're a witch. You know, just why, you know.
Own the name, baby.
Own it, you know, like, there was so much of that bonus points. If you have an N, oh, sorry, Lee is chanting for NB Witch. And an
NB Witch in YA books, yeah, would be fabulous.
Right.
Necessary.
So I do, like Beth said, Executive Pagans is my next something cover band. I do think that would be a great. Okay, April, we're gonna have to start a band.
All right, I got the drums.
Yeah, and sadly, that's what I've got. Yeah, we're just going to be doing a lot of drumming.
It's a drum circle.
Oh, yeah, I thought you said drones, and I was like, cool, whatever.
Got a couple of those too.
If you have questions, audience members, please chime in with this. How would you adapt, if you're going to write about, you know, let's just stick with earth-based religions because we're talking about that right now. If you were going to write that in outer space, how would you approach that?
I am deeply, deeply in love with the first contact subgenre for science fiction. Mm-hmm. And there are so many ways you could utilize that respectfully with an Earth-based in space and not have to end up with Avatar again.
Yes.
It's the only thing I can think of.
Also known as Dances with Wolves in Space.
Yeah, no, there are ways, Vikings in space. No, there are ways to do it, and I think that particular subgenre of science fiction has huge opportunities for that.
I really would like to see more with harder sci-fi, that integration of, and it doesn't even have to be Earth-based, just religious in general.
Mm-hmm.
What just came into my mind is the Elizabeth Moon books, yes. Which, you know, you're talking about this hard sci-fi in space. I could see books like those having protagonists who are witches or pagans or, you know, some subset, and having that somehow work to make them a better captain or warrior or whatever it is, you know, first contact person. Because certainly I have found in my own personal life, you know, that pagans in general, and as always when you're talking about paganism and witchcraft and things, it's just got to be in general because nobody's the same as anybody else, but they tend to be more accepting of other people, of people who are outside the norm, whatever the heck that is. And so if you're in space and there is no norm, well, it makes a lot of sense to have some folks out there who go, yeah, norm schmorm. Ooh.
Oh, nice.
Kaylee, you're a writer too, so you could totally go for this.
Do it.
Just some witches exploring.
You have, with science fiction especially, we have such a gorgeously blank slate.
Yeah, yeah.
There's so much you can do, and if you're intimidated by the hard sci-fi end of things, fluff it. I mean, a lot of the science fiction from even 10 years ago, you go back and read it, and it's like, oh, well, that didn't quite happen that way. And that's totally cool. We still like it.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, we've seen that exploration a little bit with Christianity. Like, I'm actually in the middle of Michael Harber's The Book of Strange New Things, which essentially is, you know, a minister who's been tapped by a NASA-esque kind of space corporation to go be the minister to a group of alien beings.
Wow.
And it's really interesting because I think that it does leave so much open to exploration from a storytelling place of how do you translate these ideas that are so connected to our experience on this earth but they're supposed to transcend everything. And so how do you connect that with something completely alien?
Somebody wants you to repeat the name.
Yep, I got it.
I wasn't sure if you could read it. Yeah, I think that kind of book would be fascinating, and I almost don't care which. I mean, for me, I would like to have it be, you know, witches or some other, you know, funky, you know. I'd like to see a bunch of, you know, Norsemen go off to space, you know, modern Norsemen, but who respect their heritage. You know, basically Vikings in space, just because it would be fun.
Inappropriate.
Yeah.
It's,
Continuation of a historical culture.
Exactly. Yeah,
and wouldn't it be great if we could have them go a Viking in space and not just be another rehash of Vikings?
Exactly.
I'm pretty sure, like, back to Crystal's executive pagans, I would love to see some well-groomed, yet maybe a little rough on the edge, space-traveling Vikings.
Me too. Up close and personal. I'm just saying.
I mean, beards in space is actually trickier than you think. It's a random piece of trivia knowledge I picked up somewhere.
Beards in Space is my next cover band.
Think of the cool grooming protocols you could have to develop to fit around this culturally. So then, making it slice of life.
Interesting. So we got about, I don't know, 10-ish, 15 something minutes left. If you do have questions,
We have a question for Q&A. One came through.
Oh, I see that now. Okay. Yeah. So are non-pagan authors, non-identifying authors qualified to write magic and fiction? Is it cool, or is it trespassing on places where we shouldn't go? In these cases, is it always necessary to have a sensitivity/content editor?
I'm gonna say it's probably a good idea for reasons noted before. I'm never gonna, if you can do it thoughtfully, respectfully, I'm not gonna deter you. I mean, as a pagan and an author, I would love to see things happening. I don't want to gatekeep, but consideration should go into it, I think, is where I'm focusing on that. So no, we're not holding the gates closed. If you don't have your tarot set and your wand, we're not going to kick you out. But maybe talk to someone who has the tarot set and the wand.
I mean, I think I'll say that I think it depends on what flavor of pagan you're writing about. Mm-hmm. B, what you want them to do in that, because at the very, very least, you need to know what of your source material is better than others. There's a lot of Norse-related fiction that is coming out these days. And you can tell when somebody has read or not read, you know, the source material that really gives you bigger viewpoints and have just kind of based this off of a website or, you know, I mean, I did read, and I'm not naming names with this at all, just a really horrible Asatru fiction based book that I genuinely don't think the author even realized the supremacist tone that they had, because it was all about, you know, the kin and the purity and the blood and all of those things that unfortunately have become code within that particular subset for some not great things. So I think even if you don't have a sensitivity reader read your stuff, find somebody to talk to that you trust who can give you the right stuff to read.
Yeah, and you're gonna have to double check some things probably. I am a Llewellyn author. I love Llewellyn books. I have many, many Llewellyn books, and periodically in referencing an older Llewellyn book in one of my more modern ones, my editor has come back and said to me, yes, we put that out, but double check it. That's not right. It's not real. It's not. And I just came across something. I was working on a Llewellyn article, and one of my favorite books got something wrong. So just because it is an official book from an official publisher that does this kind of stuff especially if it is not from the last, say, 10 or 15 years. You are going to want to double check, you know, if it says, oh, this is such and such a goddess's holiday, go look in a couple of other places and find out if it is, because it turns out it might not be.
The nuance Crystal brought up is kind of important too, especially, I mean, I come from a very heathen context for this one. Mm-hmm. And there are definite camps within the path, and some I find more palatable than others is the most politic way I can put that one. So knowing the nuanced source of your source is important. Okay. And it's going to sound super weird, but there are so many groups and organizations out now that if you don't want to formally like hire a sensitivity writer, contact some of these entities and say, hey, I came across this. What feedback can you offer? What do you know about this? It's the same thing. You'll see a lot of newbies in various religious paths talking to each other going, I found this. How credible is this? What am I getting into? What tangential is this related to, sort of context there?
I do think it's interesting, just from conversations in different groups and conventions, that people feel way more comfortable writing a Wiccan than they would writing a Buddhist or writing someone who is Islamic or sometimes even Christian. It just feels like it's more of an open playground. Thoughts on that?
Well, some of it is, I think, because of what you started out by saying at the beginning of the conversation, it is such an exploding religion. It's all of a sudden, I think, hitting people's awareness who weren't really paying a lot of attention before. So that may be part of it. And also possibly because there are so many different paths and ways to practice it. Maybe people feel like, oh, I can't get it wrong. I can always say, well, this wasn't this official one, I just made it up, which isn't strictly true. You still have to have respect. You still have to get certain things right. And
but do you think it's confusing because they could ask 3 different pagans and get 12 different answers?
Oh, heck yeah. It's confusing for those of us who practice it. It's just,
I'm gonna stick my foot in it. Don't yell at me. I think a lot of it comes too from the perception that the maybe mainstream religions have that kind of older established sense. So playing a bit off of the it's new, because a lot of at least the modern practiced incarnation of a lot of the religions we've touched on are modern incarnations. I mean, Asatru, we have no idea. We can rebuild as much we can. So sandbox isn't the right word, but it doesn't feel like this, monolith up behind you that is inscribes. I mean, talking about different paths, there are how many different versions of the Bible, though? There's still those other paths, still other permutations, but it's got that aged weight to it that maybe people aren't applying to some of the more earth-based or pagan religions that are growing in popularity.
So do you find it offensive to you as practicing other tradition folk to come across a book that's just getting it wrong? Or you just kind of shrug and move on?
I just kind of shrug.
Yeah.
I'm hard to offend in that way, but also there is so much of a hot mess of stuff being discussed, sorted out. Even on the religious end, it's hard to get angry at a novel.
True.
I also haven't run across anything that was just abusively derogatory or cruel. Mostly I've just run into the so adorably wrong that it's sweet and I move on. So I haven't run into anything that makes me want to, throw it, just kind of close it quietly and maybe not pick it back up.
Yeah. I have a writer friend who many years ago, when I was first a baby writer, she was somebody that I was reading, and she had a back then it was called chick lit. She had paranormal chick lit, and her witch main character had, you know, 3 of the 4 quarters were correct and 1 of them wasn't. And I just wrote her a very nice letter that said, you know, this one isn't quite right. And she said, oh, there's really actual colors associated with those. I just made it up. So, I mean, I wasn't offended. I just said, oh, well, if you're going to do this, you should get it right. And she actually had so little knowledge of what she was writing about that she didn't know that in Wicca, at least, there are colors associated with the quarters. And while it didn't offend me, I did sort of wish that she had done a little bit more research, and ironically, librarian. But you know, law librarian, research librarian. So Kaylee had asked if there's a writing group for sensitivity with Wicca and paganism. I don't know of one.
Not that I've seen.
I think your best bet is to find writers who are either directly connected to what it is that you're interested in. Maybe find an author who has written it and just see if they're interested in talking about it with you. That's probably going to be your best bet to start with some of that. I think it's harder because the umbrella is so huge. I think we're right that, you know, if I'm going to write a book with, you know, a very Christian character or whatever, those parameters are laid out. You can explore things within them, but, you know, it's there. And if you want to try to find source material, you know, there's a huge fight within the heathen community about whether Snorri is really accepted or not. He came 1,000 years later, so should we listen? And, you know, I just think it's harder to find that source material to guide you. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't get it right at the same time.
Yeah, you know, you may have to put forth some extra effort, but if you want to get your book right, sometimes you have to put forth some extra effort.
And it's not just about getting it right. I kind of say that glibly, but it's about, I think the writing ultimately is better if you've given it thought and it becomes that integrated kind of thing. One of my favorite series that it's not quite pagan, but it deals with magic in the contemporary world that feels absolutely effortless is Alex Bledsoe's Tufa series.
Oh God, that's wonderful. It's so fabulous.
It's just so absolutely well incorporated into that world that, you know, you're just there. You're there and you're carried along.
And there's a reason for that. He's a pagan.
But, and I think he is able to put the emotional side of things and the magic into it without worrying so much about, you know, a spell book this or a spell book that. It's just, it's a really beautiful thing. So Kaylee, that also may be a really good suggestion for you, is just to find the books that are really good fiction wise and read them and
Right.
see what works and see what doesn't work. Any other questions as we have Twitter accounts? Yes.
Yep. Mine is the very clever Deborah Blake. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, everything. It's just Deborah Blake, or like my website is deborahblakeauthor.com, and you can find all the links to everything there. But yeah, I have no imagination at all. It's surprising in an author, really.
Put my Twitter in there. Also, there's the Discord link where people are chatting after panels and just sharing ideas and different things. I will actually try to come up with a short list of the books that I feel just kind of really nail it, and put those out. I know that April mentioned Rebecca Roanhorse, which I absolutely agree with. Alex Bledsoe is on my list. It's kind of dated, but I think Lackey's Trigard series, you know.
Who is the author? Oh my God, Sterling.
S.M. Sterling.
Sterling.
Yeah,
his first 3 books.
Yes, the first 3 books were wonderful. They did sort of wander away, but the first 3 were a really good example of having a realistic pagan character, I thought. Wiccan character.
Yeah. Actually, Sterling's books are very, you know, I'm not dissing them. I just, you know, wandered away at some point from them.
But those first 3 are a good place to start.
Yeah, and it was a very interesting exploration of the idea of when most of the world's population ends and the lucky ones happen to be pagans, what happens as you rebuild society?
Gilman's Devil's West. That's good. I'm
Yes.
trying to remember this entire time for the old kind of Americana folklore sort of feel, which is valid and counts in this context again.
Well, and that's one of the other things I want to see more within fiction. Charles DeLint did this a lot with some of his work. Is don't just go back to European sources for magic. Explore the North, the American continents too, because I think that there is a lot there that has.
That's just me.
It's based something sometimes in native, so I think you want to be careful with that. But there are the own spirits that these continents have at their own point that I think could be played with a lot more. I hesitate to say this because the man himself is just not a good man. But the Alvin Maker series from Orson Scott Card.
I grew up on those. They were the first thing of that type I got exposed to as a child, which is probably why I went scrabbling after this type of writing so heavily.
Yeah.
I definitely enjoyed distancing myself from the author, but the books were so beautifully integrated, especially where there wasn't much like that around at all around.
Right.
So.
Right. So, if we don't have other questions, I'm gonna take us in for a landing. Like I said, check out the Discord channel. We'll try to pop over and throw out some recommendations because we're all going to remember them at like 2:00 this morning. It's just how it works. Otherwise, I'm going to say thank you to April and thank you to Deb. Yay. And Catherine Kimbriel, give me her last name. Is that who it is? No, not
Catherine Kimbriel.
Catherine Kimbriel. Her Night Calls series.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Yes. I love those. If you're into the,
if you're looking for the kind of the folklore,
the folklore hearth
beautiful
magic,
Americana, pulled from everything, gorgeous books.
Yeah.
Catherine Kimbriel's Night Calls. It's the beginning of a trilogy.
And definitely Alex Bledsoe's Tufa series is just stellar example of good writing. And I'm not saying that just because he's a friend of mine, but they really are.
Yeah. All right. On that note, thank you, attendees. We hope you're having a good RoberCon. I want to say thank you for supporting the convention because your support is helping to support the Robertson Museum and Science Center, which, like pretty much every nonprofit in the country right now, is struggling. So I really appreciate it. On behalf of them, thank you. And I hope you've got a great afternoon ahead of you.
Stay well.
Bye.